Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that Europe, Asia, Australia, North America, and South America have never been inhabited by modern humans. No cities, no roads, no Roman Empire, no Vikings, no United States, no Japan. Just endless forests, open grasslands, towering mountains, and wild animals, exactly as they were before anyone ever set foot there. Around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, a small group of modern humans left Africa. Every single non-African person alive today is descended from them. That one migration changed the entire course of history. But what if they never left? What if all 8 billion of us right now were still packed into a single continent and the other 6 had never seen a human footprint? This isn't just a thought experiment. It's a real question scientists have actually looked into piece by piece. So let's build this world properly from the very beginning. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago. For hundreds of thousands of years, this continent was humanity's only home, its only cradle, its only stage. And it wasn't even our first attempt to leave. There's fossil evidence of small groups reaching as far as the Middle East and simply not making either over 100,000 years ago. They died out or got pushed back by shifting climates and competition from the people already living there. The migration that finally stuck came later, starting around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Small bands pushed north and east, probably chasing food, following coastlines, running from drought, with no map and no plan. Just instinct and hunger. Within roughly 50,000 years, they'd reached the Middle East, then Asia, then Europe, then crossed into Australia, and eventually walked, on foot, across a frozen land bridge, all the way into the Americas. Now take all of that away. Not the failed attempt, not the successful one. In this version of history, nobody ever makes it out, not once. So picture it properly. All modern humans remain exactly where they started, every single one. Europe stays covered in forest, no clearings, no farmland carved into hillsides, no roads. Asia has no cities, no Silk Road, no rice paddies, no Great Wall. Australia has no human settlements at all, not even the oldest continuous living cultures on the planet, because those cultures only exist because people crossed open ocean to reach it, more than 50,000 years ago in our real history. The Americas remain completely untouched. No footprints anywhere from the Arctic Circle down to the southern tip of Patagonia. Meanwhile, back home, the population keeps climbing. There's nowhere else to go, so growth just compounds in place, generation after generation. Eventually, food and usable land start running short. The Sahara, the rainforests, the Rift Valley, these stop being just geography. They become the hard edges of everyone's entire world, the walls of the only room humanity has ever known. Here's the good news for this crowded, sealed-off population. Civilization can still absolutely emerge. It just has to happen entirely inside one continent. People discover farming, not from some flash of genius, but because hunting and gathering simply can't feed a population that keeps growing with nowhere to expand. Villages form along the Nile, the Niger, the Congo. Villages grow into towns. Towns grow into kingdoms. Writing systems get invented to track harvests, trade, and laws, because a civilization this size needs a memory bigger than any single person's. Trade routes crisscross the continent, connecting the Sahel to the coasts, the highlands to the river deltas. History keeps moving forward. It just happens in one place instead of many. And because there's no somewhere else to retreat to when things collapse, whatever gets built here has to be built to genuinely last, or it falls apart under its own weight with nowhere to run. Something else happens when an entire species is forced to share one landmass for tens of thousands of years. Incredible internal diversity. In our real history, human genetic diversity is already highest within Africa, higher than the diversity of the rest of the world combined, because everyone outside Africa descended from just a small slice of the population that originally left. If nobody ever leaves, that full range keeps branching and diversifying in place. You'd likely see dozens, maybe hundreds, of distinct languages, religions, and cultural traditions developing side by side across the continent, some trading and blending with their neighbors, others staying isolated behind mountains or deserts for thousands of years at a stretch. Different creation myths for different peoples, different gods for different rivers, different calendars tracking different rains. In a strange way, this Africa might end up holding more cultural and genetic diversity than the entire real world does today, all packed into a single landmass instead of spread across 7. Think about what that actually means in full. No Roman Empire, no ancient Greece, no Vikings, no Great Wall of China, no Maya, no Aztecs, no Inca. entire continents remain wild, not less developed, not behind, wild, untouched, precisely as they were before anyone with 2 legs and a plan ever arrived. Every empire, every war, every wonder of the ancient world you've ever learned about in school, outside of Africa, simply never happens. Not delayed by a few centuries, not slightly different, never, in any form, for as long as the isolation holds. There's no age of exploration because there's nothing left to explore. Nobody is ever more than a walk away from everything they've ever known. No worldwide trade routes carrying spices from Asia, silver from the Americas, textiles from Europe. No global exchange of ideas. No printing press crossing continents. No gunpowder traveling from China outward. No numeral systems spreading from India through the Middle East into Europe, the way they actually did in our history. Technology only develops within Africa, which means every idea has to be reinvented locally or spread from one African region to a neighboring one, never borrowed from 6 different continents the way real human progress actually worked. And here's the part worth sitting with for a second. A huge amount of real human advancement never came from any single civilization being brilliant in total isolation. It came from ideas colliding, borrowed, stolen, traded, and improved across wildly different cultures on wildly different continents. Take that away, and progress doesn't stop entirely, but it loses its single biggest engine. Here's a detail most versions of this story skip entirely. Africa was never the only place with humans-ish beings. Neanderthals were already spread across Europe and the Middle East, and had been for over 300,000 years. Denisovans occupied parts of Asia, known mostly from a handful of fossil fragments and their surviving DNA. Tiny Homo floresiensis lived on an isolated Indonesian island, standing about a meter tall, nicknamed hobbits by the researchers who found them. In our real history, our ancestors met these groups, competed with them, sometimes interbred with them, and within roughly 30,000 to 40,000 years of contact, every one of them was gone. Some scientists point to direct competition with us, others point to climate. Most think it was some mix of both. But if we never leave Africa, we're never there to tip that balance. Do they keep evolving on their own, slowly climbing towards something like agriculture or cities? Maybe. Or maybe, without the pressure and stimulation of contact with another intelligent species pushing them forward, they simply plateau, the way small, isolated populations often do, staying exactly as they are for tens of thousands of years. Either way, the rest of the planet isn't necessarily empty of anything human-like. It's just empty of us. Without humans arriving to tip the balance, the rest of the world doesn't sit frozen and waiting. It keeps evolving too, just without us anywhere in the story. In real history, human arrival in Australia and the Americas lines up suspiciously well with the extinction of giant animals. Mammoths and mastodons in North America, giant ground sloths and armored glyptodonts in South America, enormous flightless birds and giant marsupials in Australia. Scientists still argue over how much of that was direct hunting versus the climate swings at the end of the last ice age, but the timing, repeating across multiple separate continents, is hard to explain away entirely. In this world, without human hunters ever arriving, a lot of that megafauna likely survives far longer, maybe even into the present day. Ecosystems across the Americas, Australia, and much of Europe would look genuinely alien to us, closer to the Ice Age world than the one we actually inherited. No cities, no farmland carved into grassland, no roads cutting through forest, just wilderness. On a scale humans have never actually witnessed firsthand, because by the time we had the tools to document a world like this, we'd already changed it beyond recognition. So would this Africa-only humanity ever reach anything close to our modern world? Almost certainly, yes. We'd still invent tools, governments, science, and quite possibly machines. We are a stubbornly inventive species, and a few 100,000 years is an enormous stretch of time to work with. But the timeline of technology would look very different, and likely much slower in specific places. Historically, industrialization needed particular resources in particular locations. Accessible coal and iron in places like Britain, oil found later in the Middle East and the Americas, and rare metals scattered across the entire globe. Africa has real resources of its own. Oil and natural gas in the north and west, some of the largest gold, diamond, platinum, and cobalt reserves on Earth in the south. But not everything that historically built the modern world happens to sit under one single continent. That might mean this civilization skips certain technological phases entirely and leans much harder into others we barely explored, purely because of what's locally available to work with. It's still progress. It's just built from a completely different set of building blocks, forced to be resourceful in the most literal sense. sense, because there's no importing what the continent simply doesn't have. Now, it's worth pushing back on our own premise for a moment, because humans never leave ever again for the rest of history is a strong claim to make for tens of thousands of years straight. Real history shows humans as relentless explorers. We tried and failed to leave over 100,000 years ago, then simply tried again until it worked. Even after that migration succeeded, humans kept pushing into brutal, unlikely environments. The high Arctic, the open Pacific on simple rafts, the thin air of the high Andes, places with no obvious reason to go except curiosity and hunger for more. So the more honest version of this scenario probably isn't never, forever. It's closer to every attempt keeps failing for tens of thousands of years due to some mix of geography, climate, disease, or plain bad luck before it eventually happens on a much longer delay. Maybe it happens 50,000 years later than it actually did. Maybe it happens in a completely different direction, say, across open ocean instead of through the Middle East, simply because that route becomes viable first by pure chance. Either way, this single shift changes everything downstream. A delay of even 10 or 20,000 years means an even more crowded, more evolved, more technologically distinct Africa eventually does make contact with the rest of the world, quite possibly on drastically different terms than what actually happened. So picture that delayed version. Tens of thousands of years pass. Africa's population keeps climbing, keeps innovating under pressure, keeps fighting over resources, and occasionally uniting into larger and larger societies. When migration finally happens, whether by boat, by a shifting land route, or by finally forcing through a previously blocked path, the people leaving aren't a handful of hunter-gatherer bands anymore. They're leaving as a far larger, far more organized, far more technologically developed population than the original migrants ever were. What do they find when they finally arrive? Possibly still thriving Neanderthal and Denisovan populations, with tens of thousands of extra years and zero competition behind them. Possibly enormous surviving megafauna that never went through an extinction event at all. Possibly nothing but untouched wilderness, completely unclaimed by anyone. That first contact, whenever and however it finally happens, wouldn't look anything like our real history's slow, patchy spread over 50,000 years. It could look like a sudden, overwhelming expansion, one enormously built-up civilization pouring outward into continents that had never seen anything like it before. One migration changed everything. Every civilization outside Africa, every empire, every war, every invention you've ever learned about that didn't happen on African soil exists only because a small group of people once decided to keep walking instead of turning back. If they had never left, Earth would be almost unrecognizable to us. One vast, deeply layered civilization on a single continent, holding more internal diversity than our entire real world does today. 6 other continents left wild, untouched, still running on Ice Age rules, home to creatures and cousins of our own species that, in our timeline, never got the chance to keep existing. The future of our entire species may have depended on a single decision made by people who had absolutely no idea what they were setting in motion when they took one more step and then another and never looked back. So, would this Africa-only world have eventually caught up to ours, or fallen permanently behind? Would it have ended up kinder, harsher, or just unrecognizably different? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if this kind of what if is your thing, subscribe. There's a lot more of these coming.